The mysterious voice at night. It was an early autumn evening when the Mason family arrived at their new home, a charming old house nestled under a canopy of tall, whispering pine trees. The house was warm and inviting, with big windows, wooden floors, and a large, cozy fireplace in the living room. The family consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Mason and their two children, Max and Lily, ages 10 and 8. After living in the city for years, this small, quiet town and the house they now called home felt like an adventure waiting to unfold. As they unpacked and arranged their belongings, the kids were brimming with excitement. Max immediately ran to explore the backyard, while Lily admired the old, creaky staircase that led up to the bedrooms. They loved the idea of having their own rooms. Lily's was painted a pale blue, and Max's had green walls that reminded him of forests and fields. "Isn't this place amazing?" Max whispered to Lily as they explored every nook and cranny of the house. "It's like something out of a storybook." Lily replied, her eyes wide with wonder. That night, after a long day of unpacking and settling in, the family shared a simple dinner and then headed to bed early. The house was so quiet at night, especially compared to the noisy city they had left behind. Max and Lily felt like they could hear every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of the wind. But just as they were beginning to drift off, they heard something strange. It was a soft, almost haunting sound coming from somewhere in the distance. It was faint, but unmistakable, a soft, muffled voice that seemed to call out from within the walls of the house. "Max, did you hear that?" Lily whispered from her bed, her voice trembling slightly. Max's heart pounded, but he didn't want to scare his little sister. "It's probably just the wind," he replied, trying to sound brave. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. Each night, the voice returned. Sometimes it was barely audible, and other times it seemed almost close enough to touch. It was as though the house itself was alive, whispering secrets from another time. Max and Lily tried to tell themselves it was just their imagination, but the curiosity grew with each passing night. 3 days later, on a sunny afternoon, they decided to explore the neighborhood. They walked down the quiet street, admiring the old houses with their ivy-covered walls and colorful gardens. They passed a few people along the way, all of whom seemed friendly and warm, giving them welcoming smiles and waves. Eventually, they reached the end of the street, where they saw an old, somewhat neglected house with chipped paint and a garden that had grown wild. Sitting on the porch was a frail, elderly woman with snow-white hair and gentle, sad eyes. She looked up as they approached, and her face softened into a warm, albeit lonely smile. "Hello, dears," she greeted them in a gentle voice. "Hi," Max and Lily chimed, a little shy but excited to meet someone new. "I'm Mrs. Winters," the old lady introduced herself. "I used to have neighbors your age. It's nice to see young faces around here again." They sat and chatted with her for a while, finding her stories of the town's past fascinating. Mrs. Winters told them about the time she and her siblings used to play in these very streets, how they used to chase fireflies in the summer and skate on the frozen pond in the winter. But as she spoke, a shadow of sadness seemed to cloud her eyes. When Max asked about her family, Mrs. Winters hesitated, a slight quiver in her voice. They live far away now," she said, glancing away. "Life takes people in different directions, I suppose." Max and Lily exchanged a glance. They could sense a loneliness in Mrs. Winters that tugged at their hearts. The next day, after school, Max and Lily went back to Mrs. Winters' house with a basket of muffins their mother had baked. They spent the afternoon helping her tidy up the garden, pulling weeds, and trimming overgrown bushes. Mrs. Winters was delighted, her eyes sparkling with gratitude as she watched the children work. "Oh, you two are angels," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's been so long since I've had any company." Over the next few days, Max and Lily made it a routine to visit Mrs. Winters after school. They brought her little gifts, a drawing Lily had made, a book Max thought she might like, and in return, Mrs. Winters shared more stories about her life, about her family, and even about the house Max and Lily had moved into. One evening, as they were sitting on her porch, Mrs. Winters revealed something that left the children wide-eyed. "You know, your house has a story of its own," she said with a twinkle in her eye. "I used to visit there as a child. My best friend lived there, and we spent hours playing and telling stories. Sometimes we'd even sneak out at night and whisper to each other through the walls." Max and Lily gasped. Could it be that the voice they had heard was connected to this past? But Mrs. Winters continued, her voice becoming softer, almost as if she were talking to herself. "After my friend moved away, I'd sometimes visit the house, hoping I might hear her voice again. I suppose it's silly, but sometimes I could almost hear her whispers in the night." The children listened in awe, realizing that perhaps the voice they'd been hearing wasn't something to fear, but a reminder of the friendship that once lived within those walls. They felt a renewed sense of purpose to make Mrs. Winters feel loved and appreciated, as she had once shared her joy with others. They decided to do everything they could to bring happiness into Mrs. Winters' life. They decorated her house with garlands made of autumn leaves, baked cookies with her, and even organized a small tea party, inviting a few neighbors to join. Slowly, Mrs. Winters' house began to look less lonely, her eyes brighter, her laughter more frequent. One night, as they tucked into bed, Max and Lily heard the familiar voice once more. But this time, it didn't seem haunting or eerie. Instead, it felt warm and comforting, as though the house was thanking them for bringing joy to its walls again. The next day, they shared their experience with Mrs. Winters, who chuckled softly. "Perhaps it's my old friend, watching over us," she said with a gentle smile. Maybe she's glad to see the house filled with laughter once more. From then on, Max and Lily felt a special connection to their house. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a place with a soul, a place that remembered and cherished the people who had loved it. As the seasons changed, the Masons and Mrs. Winters became like family. They celebrated birthdays together, watched movies, and had endless tea parties filled with laughter and love. Mrs. Winters had become part of their lives, and her once lonely house was now a warm, inviting home once more. Years passed, but Max and Lily never forgot the magical experience they had in that house. They grew up, went to college, and eventually moved away, but they always returned to visit Mrs. Winters and to listen for the whispers of friendship that still echoed through the walls of Whispering Pines.